I never thought I'd be the kind of person who goes through someone else's phone. But there I was, sitting on the edge of our bed at 2 a.m, staring at David's phone screen with trembling hands. He'd left it charging on the nightstand, and when it lit up with a notification, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The browser history was right there, impossible to ignore. Page after page of searches, websites, videos, all featuring transgender women. My husband of 8 years had been living a secret life that I knew nothing about. The timestamp showed this had been going on for months, maybe years. Late nights when he said he was working overtime, early mornings before I woke up, stolen moments when I was in the shower or grocery shopping. I felt like I was drowning. The room spun around me as I scrolled through the evidence of his hidden desires. My mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. Who was this man I'd been sharing a bed with? How long had he been lying to me? What did this mean for our marriage, for our future, for everything I thought I knew about the person I loved? The worst part wasn't the discovery itself. It was the realization that I had been living with a stranger. All those times he'd seemed distant, distracted, unavailable, now made terrible sense. He hadn't been pulling away from me because of work stress or midlife crisis. He'd been pulling away because he was wrestling with desires he couldn't acknowledge, couldn't share, couldn't even admit to himself. I sat there until dawn, phone in my lap, watching the sun creep through our bedroom curtains. David stirred beside me, and for a moment, I considered pretending I'd never seen anything. It would be easier to live in ignorance than to face whatever truth was waiting for us. But I couldn't unknow what I now knew. The secret was eating me alive, and I hadn't even been the one keeping it. When he finally woke up, I was sitting in the kitchen with his phone on the table between us. I'd made coffee, but neither of us touched it. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. He looked at the phone, then at me, and I saw something die in his eyes. Not love. Recognition. He knew that I knew. "We need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He shook his head, not in denial but in defeat. "I can't." "You have to. We have to." But he couldn't. For 3 days we lived in the same house like ghosts, passing each other in hallways, sharing meals in silence, sleeping on opposite sides of a bed that felt like an ocean. He went to work, came home, ate dinner, watched television, went to bed. But he wouldn't talk. He wouldn't explain. He wouldn't even look at me. On the 4th day, I cornered him in the garage. He was pretending to organize his tools, but I could see his hands shaking as he moved screwdrivers from one drawer to another. "David, please." "I need to understand." He turned to face me, and I saw tears streaming down his face. "That's not me," he whispered. "That's not who I am. But the history, the websites, the searches, they're all there. In your phone. From your account." "That's not me," he repeated, louder this time. "I don't know why I look at that stuff. I don't know why I can't stop. But that's not me. I'm not gay. I'm not into that. I love you. I married you. I want to be with you." I could see the war raging inside him, the battle between what he felt and what he thought he should feel, between his desires and his identity, between his truth and his fear. He was tearing himself apart, and I was watching it happen. "Maybe we should see someone," I suggested. "A counselor, a therapist, someone who can help us work through this." He shook his head violently. "I'm not talking to some stranger about this. I'm not admitting to anything, because there's nothing to admit. This is just a phase. It's stress. It's the internet. It's not real." But it was real. The evidence was undeniable. More than that, I could see it in his eyes, in the way he looked at me now, like I was holding a loaded gun to his head. He was terrified that I could see through his denials, that I might force him to confront parts of himself he'd spent years trying to bury. That night I lay awake listening to him toss and turn beside me. I wanted to reach out, to touch his shoulder, to tell him that whatever he was going through, we could face it together. But I knew that any gesture from me would only make him retreat further into himself. He was building walls around his secret, and I was on the wrong side of them. The next morning I found him in the kitchen, dressed for work, but not moving. He was staring at his coffee cup like it might contain answers to questions he couldn't ask. "I've been thinking," I said carefully, "about what you said. About this not being you." He looked up hopefully, probably thinking I was going to let him off the hook, pretend this conversation had never happened. "I think you're right," I continued. "I think the person who's been hiding this from me, who's been living a lie, who's been so afraid of his own feelings that he can't even talk to his wife about them, that's not you. That's not the David I married. The David I married was honest. He was brave. He trusted me with his heart." His face crumpled. "I am being honest." "No, you're not. You're lying to me. And you're lying to yourself. And I can't live with lies, David. I can't build a marriage on secrets and denial." He stood up so fast his chair toppled over. "So what are you saying? You're leaving me? Because of some websites? Because of something that doesn't even mean anything?" "I'm saying I need my husband back. The real one. The one who isn't afraid to be human. Who isn't afraid to have complicated feelings. Who isn't afraid to trust me with his truth." He was crying now, ugly sobs that shook his whole body. "I can't be what you saw on that phone. I can't be that person. I'm not asking you to be anyone. I'm asking you to be honest about who you are." But he couldn't. Or wouldn't. The conversation ended the same way they all did, with him walking away, shutting down, retreating into silence. I was losing him, not to someone else, but to his own fear. Days turned into weeks. We existed in the same space but lived separate lives. He deleted his browser history religiously now, but I could see the guilt eating him alive. He'd gained weight, lost sleep, developed a nervous habit of checking his phone constantly to make sure nothing incriminating was visible. He was exhausted from the effort of keeping his secret, but he was more terrified of letting it go. I found myself studying him in quiet moments, trying to reconcile the man I'd married with the stranger he'd become. Had he always been this way? Had I missed the signs? Or was this something new, something that had developed over time? I replayed our entire relationship in my head, looking for clues, for moments when he might have been trying to tell me something he couldn't say out loud. There were things, now that I thought about it. His discomfort with certain topics, his quick deflections when conversations turned to sexuality or gender, the way he'd always been unusually supportive of LGBTQ+ rights, more passionate about equality than seemed typical for a straight man from his background. His fascination with drag shows, which he'd always explained away as appreciation for the artistry and performance. But mostly, I remembered the way he looked at me in the beginning, like I was the most beautiful woman in the world, like he couldn't believe his luck. When had that changed? When had he started looking at me like I was a comfortable habit instead of a passion? The breakthrough came, strangely enough, from my sister. She'd been worried about me, could see I was struggling even though I hadn't told her why. She came over one evening when David was working late, or claiming to be, and found me crying over a bottle of wine. "What's going on?" she asked, sitting beside me on the couch. "You look like you haven't slept in weeks." I told her everything. The discovery, the confrontations, the silence, the lies. She listened without judgment, without shock, without the kind of dramatic reaction I'd been afraid of. "So, he's attracted to transgender women," she said when I finished. "And he's ashamed of it. He says it's not real, that it's not who he is. But it is real. It's his reality, and he's terrified of it. I nodded, wiping my eyes. I don't know what to do. I want to help him, but I don't know how. And I'm tired of being married to someone who won't let me know him. Have you considered that maybe this isn't about you at all? I looked at her, confused. I mean, yes, it affects you because you're married to him. But his struggle, his fear, his denial, that's about him. About his own internalized shame, his own expectations of what he should be. You can't fix that for him. You can't love him out of it, or argue him out of it, or threaten him out of it. He has to do the work himself. But what about our marriage? What about our future? That depends on whether he's willing to do the work, and whether you're willing to wait while he figures it out. That night, I made a decision. I couldn't keep living in limbo, waiting for David to become brave enough to face his truth. I couldn't keep walking on eggshells, pretending I didn't know what I knew. I had to take control of my own life, my own happiness, my own future. When he came home, I was waiting in the living room with 2 cups of tea and a printed list of therapists who specialized in sexuality and gender issues. I've made an appointment, I said before he could speak. For me, with a counselor. I need help processing what I've learned about my husband, about my marriage, about myself. He sat down heavily, looking at the papers in my hand. I told you, I'm not talking to anyone about this. I know, this appointment is for me. But I'm hoping you'll consider making one for yourself. Because I can't keep living like this, David. I can't keep pretending we don't have a problem. We don't have a problem. You're creating a problem where there isn't one. The problem isn't your attraction to transgender women. The problem is that you're so ashamed of it that you can't even acknowledge it exists. The problem is that you're lying to yourself and to me. The problem is that you're so afraid of being judged that you've forgotten how to be honest. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the floor. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but determined. What if I can't change? What if this is just who I am? Then that's who you are. And we'll figure out what that means for us. You'd stay with me? Even if I'm not the man you thought you married. I fell in love with your heart, David. Your kindness, your humor, your intelligence, your integrity. I didn't fall in love with your browsing history. But I can't love someone who won't let me see him. I can't build a life with someone who's living a lie. He was crying again, but this time it felt different. Less desperate, more relieved. Like he'd been holding his breath for months and was finally allowing himself to exhale. I don't understand it, he whispered. I don't understand why I'm attracted to them. It doesn't make sense with who I thought I was. Maybe it doesn't have to make sense. Maybe it just has to be true. What if people find out? What if they judge me? What if they think I'm gay or weird or perverted? What if they do? What if they don't? What if it doesn't matter what anyone else thinks as long as we're honest with each other? He looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. You really wouldn't leave me? I might leave you if you keep lying to me. I might leave you if you keep shutting me out. I might leave you if you decide that your shame is more important than our marriage. But I won't leave you for having feelings you can't control. That was the beginning of our real conversation. Not the end of our problems, but the beginning of our honesty. He didn't transform overnight into someone comfortable with his desires. I didn't immediately become the perfectly understanding wife who never felt hurt or confused or angry. We both had work to do. David did eventually start seeing a therapist, though it took him 6 weeks to work up the courage to make the appointment. He chose a woman, Dr. Martinez, who specialized in sexual identity and shame. For the first few sessions, he mostly sat in silence. But gradually he began to open up about his feelings, his fears, his self-hatred. Meanwhile, I was doing my own work with a counselor, trying to understand my own reactions, my own fears, my own needs. I learned that I'd been taking his secrecy personally, interpreting his inability to share as a rejection of me. I learned that I couldn't fix his shame, but I could stop enabling it by pretending it didn't exist. The hardest part was learning to sit with uncertainty. David's attraction to transgender women didn't fit neatly into any category I understood. He wasn't gay. He was still attracted to me, still wanted to be with me. He wasn't transgender himself. He was comfortable with his gender identity. He wasn't looking to have an affair or leave our marriage. He was just attracted to transgender women in addition to cisgender women like me. Does it matter? Dr. Martinez asked during one of our joint sessions. Does it matter what label you put on it? Does it matter if it fits into a neat category? It matters to me, David said. I need to understand what this means about who I am. What if it doesn't mean anything about who you are? What if it's just one aspect of your sexuality, not a defining characteristic of your identity? This was revolutionary thinking for both of us. We'd been so focused on what his attraction meant, what it said about him, what it implied about our marriage, that we'd forgotten it might not mean anything at all, beyond the simple fact that he found certain people attractive. I think, I said slowly, that I've been afraid this means you don't really want me, that you're settling for me because you can't have what you really want. David turned to look at me, his eyes wide with surprise. That's not true. At all. I love you. I want to be with you. I want to build a life with you. This other thing, it's just something I think about. It's not something I need to act on. But you've been so secretive about it. So ashamed. I thought that meant it was more important to you than I was. I was ashamed because I thought it meant something terrible about me. I thought if you knew, you'd think I was disgusting or perverted or gay or, I don't know. I thought you'd leave me, so you almost made me leave you by lying to me instead. He laughed, but it was a bitter sound. I'm not very smart sometimes. You're scared. There's a difference. Our progress wasn't linear. There were setbacks, arguments, moments when David retreated back into shame and secrecy. There were times when I felt overwhelmed by the complexity of our situation, when I wondered if it would be easier to just walk away and start over with someone whose sexuality was less complicated. But there were also breakthroughs, moments when David shared something vulnerable, and I responded with acceptance instead of judgment. Times when I expressed my own fears and insecurities, and he listened without getting defensive. Conversations where we talked about attraction and desire and identity without anyone running away or shutting down. 6 months after the discovery, we had what felt like our first real conversation about sex in years. Not just the mechanics of it, but the psychology behind it. The fantasy life we'd both been keeping private. The things we thought about, but never said out loud. I want to understand, I told him. Not because I'm judging you, but because I want to know you. All of you. He was quiet for a long time, gathering courage. I think I'm attracted to the idea of someone who's both masculine and feminine, who's strong and soft at the same time, who's had to fight to become who they are. That's beautiful, I said. And I meant it. Really? Really. It's not threatening to me. It's not taking anything away from us. It's just part of who you are. I was so afraid you'd think I was sick or perverted. I think you're human. I think you're complicated. I think you're more interesting than I gave you credit for. We still had practical questions to navigate. Would this always be just fantasy for him? Or would he eventually want to explore it in real life? How would we handle it if he did? What were the boundaries of our marriage? And were we both comfortable with them? But we were finally having these conversations instead of avoiding them. We were finally being honest instead of pretending. We were finally building something real instead of maintaining something false. A year later, David was a different person. Not because his attractions had changed, but because his relationship with shame had transformed. He had learned to separate his desires from his identity, to see his sexuality as one aspect of himself rather than a defining characteristic. He'd learned that being attracted to transgender women didn't make him gay or straight or anything other than human. More importantly, he'd learned that honesty was less scary than secrecy, that being known was less terrifying than being hidden, that my love for him wasn't conditional on his conforming to some narrow definition of acceptable masculinity. I was different too. I'd learned that love isn't about understanding everything about your partner, but about accepting them even when you don't understand. I'd learned that marriage isn't about finding someone who fits perfectly into your expectations, but about growing together as you both evolve and change. We still go to counseling, both individually and together. We still have difficult conversations about desire and identity and the future. But we have them openly now, without shame or secrecy or fear. We have them as partners who are committed to knowing each other fully, even when that knowledge is complicated or challenging. David still finds transgender women attractive. I still don't completely understand what that means or why it's important to him. But I don't need to understand it to accept it. I don't need to share his attractions to respect them. I don't need to have all the answers to love him completely. What I needed was honesty. What I needed was trust. What I needed was a husband who was brave enough to be vulnerable, who was willing to let me see him fully, who understood that intimacy requires courage. The secret that almost destroyed our marriage became, in the end, the catalyst for saving it. Not because we solved it or resolved it or made it go away, but because we learned to live with it honestly. We learned that love isn't about perfection or simplicity or fitting into neat categories. Love is about seeing someone completely and choosing them anyway. Love is about being seen completely and trusting that you'll be chosen anyway. Today, when David's phone lights up with a notification, I don't feel that spike of anxiety I used to feel. Not because I'm not curious about what he's looking at, but because I know he'll tell me if it's something important. Not because his browsing history is now an open book, but because we've learned to talk about the things that matter. We've learned that a marriage can survive discovery, can survive secrets, can survive the complicated reality of human sexuality. But it can't survive lies. It can't survive shame. It can't survive the decision to hide from each other instead of being vulnerable together. The man I married 8 years ago wasn't the man I thought he was. He was more complicated, more conflicted, more human than I'd understood. But he was also braver than I'd given him credit for, more capable of growth, more worthy of love than either of us had believed. Our marriage isn't perfect. We're not perfect. But we're real now in a way we never were before. We're honest now in a way that felt impossible a year ago. We're building something genuine instead of maintaining something false. And that, I've learned, is worth fighting for. That's worth the difficult conversations and the uncomfortable truths and the complicated questions that don't have easy answers. That's worth the work of learning to love someone, not despite their complexity, but because of it. The discovery that almost ended our marriage became the beginning of our real relationship. The secret that almost destroyed us became the foundation for something stronger. The shame that almost drove us apart became the catalyst for bringing us together. We're still figuring it out. We're still having difficult conversations. We're still learning what it means to love someone fully, to be known completely, to build a life together without hiding who we are. But we're doing it together now, honestly, openly, without shame or secrecy or fear. And that makes all the difference.